dogs can detect a teaspoon of sugar in 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Clara Wilson, a PhD candidate at Queen's University Belfast in the UK. Clara studies how dogs' sense of smell can help humans, especially the surprising ways dogs can help humans in detecting diseases and helping those with disabilities. I'm very excited to hear more about case studies of dogs detecting bombs, COVID-19, cancer, and more. Thank you again so much for taking the time to join me today. I really do believe that people are going to have their eyes opened by this episode. But before we get started with everything, I'd just love to hear a little bit about, who you are and what drew you to this field of work.
Great. So my name's Clara Wilson. I'm completing a PhD at Queen's University Belfast on canine olfaction and behaviour. And by olfaction here, I just mean a dog's sense of smell. So I did my undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Sussex. And it was here that I was introduced to the area of animal cognition as a research field. I was lucky enough to work with Professor Karen McComb and Leanne Proops, who do really interesting work in how different animals interpret human cues, such as vocal and facial expressions, among other things. And it was from here that I really knew I wanted to stay in the animal behavior field. So I then went on to do my master's in applied animal behavior and welfare at the University of Edinburgh. And it was during this time that I became really interested in dogs assisting humans, especially in new and emerging ways. So I relocated to the University of Bristol with Dr. Nicola Rooney to collaborate with Medical Detection Dogs. And Medical Detection Dogs is a charity here in the UK that trains and supplies medical assistance dogs.
And to, just ask about your background, were you always a dog person growing up?
Yes, I was a very animal interested child. And when I was growing up, I think the rhetoric was largely that if you were interested in animals, you should become a vet. So that was something I had been interested in when I was younger. I would want to go to the vets to get learning experience. But the studies that you have to do at school are quite prescriptive here. And I didn't want to do those at the time. So I was really interested in animals, but during those school years, I wasn't hyper-focused on maths and science, but I was really interested in psychology and the way that the brain works. So I decided to go down that route. And it was from there that I realized that animal cognition was even a field. So I was like, this is amazing because I get to do the part of animals that I'm actually really interested in, which is their learning and behavior. But I just didn't know it existed until then. So I'm really lucky that I happened to be able to do some additional lectures in it at the time.
Some people, they might be listening to this podcast and they didn't know that this existed either. So there might be other people who are inspired to go on this path. And I'd love to hear day to day. Is it just, a bunch of dogs that you work with in your workplace?
So at the moment, because I'm based at Queen's, we have an animal behavior centre, but there's no kind of overarching research projects ongoing. It's just each individual student's projects. So I just finished conducting my studies before Christmas, and I had people's pet dogs coming in. They were my study subjects. So that's quite unusual. A lot of other studies don't use pet dogs, but because we don't have a cohort of dogs available to us, when I was collecting my data, yes, I'd be in the lab all day having pet dogs come in to me for an hour at a time for training. But at the moment, because I'm writing up, it's very different. I'm just at my laptop all day. No dogs anymore, unfortunately, but hopefully more dogs in my future.
Sounds like a great job, both for you and the dogs. Now, to move on to the science here, many people know that dogs can be used as guides for the blind. But what are some other things that dogs can help us humans with?
Yes. So I will first of all just go over some of the definitions because some of the terms can get a bit confusing. So here, a service or an assistance animal means a dog that's been trained to do a specific task that benefits an individual with a disability. So this could be a physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other disability. But that, as you were saying, these can be split up into different categories. So some of the most commonly known ones are guide dogs for people who are blind or visually impaired, and also hearing dogs for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. There are other service dogs who are for people with physical disabilities or just disabilities other than vision or hearing, such as physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, autism, and other medical conditions. And then the area that I specialize in is medical alert dogs. And these are dogs using their smell to detect and alert to medical conditions such as seizures, diabetic glucose fluctuations, allergens in the environment, and other types of medical conditions. But importantly, these dogs are using their sense of smell. So all of these different types of dogs that I've just explained differ from emotional support dogs. And that's because they've been trained to assist with a specific disability rather than providing general support. And these assistance and service dogs have been being trained for centuries, if not longer. So there are reports, for example, of guide dogs being trained in 1780, although dogs haven't been systematically trained in large groups since the First World War for guiding specifically. So as I said, I'm very interested in dogs' sense of smell and their ability to use that sense of smell to help humans. So some of the interesting areas in which dogs and humans differ is their actual machinery to be able to sense smell and then interpret it. So for example, there's an area called the olfactory epithelium, which is at the back of the nasal passage, and it houses your sensory receptors. And humans have about 1 square inch of the olfactory epithelium, whereas dogs have 30 square inches. So for humans, we have around 6 million receptors, whereas dogs have around 250 million receptors. And another big area of difference is that, so in the brain, there's an area called the olfactory bulb, and that's where the information from the epithelium is processed. And dogs' olfactory bulbs are 3 times larger than that of a human's, even though a human's brain is 10 times bigger. So proportionally, you can imagine what kind of impact that would have. And an analogy that is often referred to in the odor detection world is that dogs can detect a teaspoon of sugar in 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water. And in comparison, so there are some people who we call super sniffers who are hired by NASA and stuff because they have this amazing sense of smell. We can smell a teaspoon of sugar in a mug of tea or a mug of water. So I personally can't do that, but some people can. And a super sniffer would be even better than that by a small magnitude. And yeah, my interest is utilizing this sense of smell to benefit human health conditions.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point. Humans, we rely so much on our visual sense. But because of that, I really want to ask you about this weird thing for most people, which is that you said you can get dogs that, alert you to medical conditions. For most people, it's just what? How's the dog going to smell if you have diabetes or if you have, a heart attack or whatever?
Yes. So I think something interesting that you said there, which I would like to pick up on, is that because we're so vision centric, a lot of these things have actually come from anecdotal evidence of dogs doing them first, and then we've systematically researched it. So it wasn't even conceived that things like cancer would have an odor until things like dogs paying specific attention to tumor sites. Those kinds of anecdotal reports came up. And then now that we've systematically researched it, we're beginning to realize that these things do have a systematic odor. So the way that dogs can do this is because of what are called volatile organic compounds. And these are odors that are emitted all the time through our breath, our sweat, our urine, basically any kind of process that's going on in our body. We're releasing these volatile organic compounds, and I'll call them VOCs for short. And different physiological processes within the body produce different VOC signatures. So at any one time, you're producing hundreds of VOCs, but a specific process, for example, my blood glucose level dropping, will have a specific VOC profile, and that is what we believe the dogs are detecting. So the concept of dogs detecting the odor of different health conditions has grown in popularity, especially over the last couple of decades, but it is really divided into 2 different classifications. So we have our medical alert dogs, but we also have our biomedical detection dogs. And both of these roles are utilizing the dog's sense of olfaction to benefit humans. And both of them are going by this process of different VOCs being emitted by humans. However, the setting in which the dog is performing this task is very different. So in medical alert dog, those are the dogs who I was describing earlier who would be placed with an owner, and they're detecting an odor associated with the specific condition. For example, diabetic alert dogs who are detecting high and low glucose fluctuations in the owner's blood glucose levels, or seizure alert dogs, that kind of thing. They're assisting a human. A biomedical detection dog is not assisting a person one-on-one. They're instead working in the laboratory with us to provide more information on different human health conditions. So the biodetection dogs are the dogs that you'd be hearing about who can detect cancer, COPD, those kinds of health conditions. But despite the image that this conjures up of a dog going around a hospital, these dogs would never meet patients in real life. They're working on samples provided to us from participants or from hospitals. So the application of these two roles is quite different because those are very high stakes, and ethically we wouldn't want dogs determining a diagnosis. We are instead using the information that the dog is giving us to develop technology that could do that more objectively and also just to a high level. Obviously, dogs get tired. You can't expect dogs to be processing hundreds of samples every day. So we really want a machine to do this instead. But the dog is this basically kind of like a black box for us because you can give them different samples and they can categorize it as cancer or non-cancer. And we are trying to recreate that using technology, because it would just be amazing if you could diagnose early stages of cancer with a breath or a urine test. So we're trying to figure out exactly what is happening when the dog is able to discriminate between those types of samples and then recreate that using technology and developing these electronic noses.
So if I could first try to say back, what I heard, you first talked about VOCs, volatile organic compounds. You're basically saying that a body is releasing chemicals that, the dog's nose can then pick up. Those chemicals are changing all the time. The dogs can tell, I don't know. I met Clara yesterday. She smells a bit funny today. I don't know what's going on, but then, they can pick up a lot more than we can. Then you mentioned, how we're literally like recreating dog noses. So current technology still cannot match that standard that dogs are at.
If you think about it, the sheer number of sensors and receptors and the connectivity aspect is just beyond, it's not beyond human comprehension, but it's beyond our capacity to just rebuild right now. So when we're doing it with dogs, we're working backwards. We're giving them whole samples. So for example, the ovarian cancer detection project that's going on at Penn Vet, we use blood plasma. So this is just some blood plasma not taken near the cancer site, just from the person in general. And the person either has malignant tumor, a benign tumor, or is a healthy control. And the dog only learns what is important to them by sheer exposure. So the dog wouldn't naturally have any inclination towards any of those samples. At this level, the dog doesn't have any intrinsic understanding of someone sick. We would train them, for example, to say, okay, this cancer sample, this is your target. I want you to pay attention to this one, so that they alert to it. So they either stand and stare or they sit in front of it. And that's them telling you that they found what you've taught them. But they only learn that through many, many examples. So to begin with, they might just remember person A's blood plasma. And now I'm showing them person B, who also has cancer. But the common thread between those two isn't obvious to begin with. They need to see many, many examples of different people with the same cancer before they say, okay, it's this common thread that's the same. And that's what's really tricky, because each individual will smell very, very different.
I think in general, it might be helpful. Could you define, what does it actually look like to train one of these medical alert dogs or these dogs working in the laboratories?
Yes. So we are using positive reinforcement, and that just means that the dog receives a reward for doing the correct behavior. And scientific evidence has really backed up that reward-based training is the most effective and humane way to train an animal. And you can also get down to very specific levels. So it's a really good method for us. So For the lab dogs, I would, as I've just kind of explained, but very briefly, we would train what's called an alert behavior. And that's so the dog can communicate that they found what I've been trying to teach them to look for. And to do that, you would give them a reward. I prefer food because you could administer a lot of goes without tiring the dog out so much, but it depends what the dog's preference is. And that just reinforces the dog that that was the right thing. So to begin with, you would know that you knew which samples you were giving them. You knew you were rewarding them for cancer. And that has to be established for a long, long time before you could ever then be giving them unknown samples. But just to switch to the medical assistant side, I wanted to give an example of the diabetic alert dogs, because the recognition of the sample might be broadly similar, but there's an extra layer where they have to be working alongside a person. So my project was on dogs supporting people with type 1 diabetes, and they also had hypoglycemic unawareness. So type 1 diabetes is just the term for people who are not producing any of their own insulin. And the hypoglycemia just means low blood glucose levels. So I'd be talking about hypo and hyper. So hyper is high. And hypoglycemic unawareness just means that they have absolutely no sensation associated with their blood glucose levels dropping drastically. Some people will be able to sense when their glucose levels are changing, but people who have type 1 and a hypoglycemic unawareness just don't know. So they can get in a lot of trouble if they feel fine, and then they could be in a coma within 10 minutes with no warning signs in between. So that's why dogs here would be really helpful, because if they're smelling that change and can alert you, you can get to safety, or you can do steps to intervene in the meantime. So to train a dog to do that, you would first need them to find that smell interesting and rewarding. So really early anecdotal reports of dogs detecting people's blood glucose levels weren't necessarily positive. So some dogs actually would, for example, run and hide when they could smell, because they hadn't had any training to reinforce it was a good thing. But these were our earliest inklings that they might be smelling something. So what we would want to do is collect samples from someone when they were in hypoglycemia, and you would kind of hide it on a body or present it to them at the very earliest stages and just reward them for paying any attention to it. They don't have to perform a behavior, they just have to smell it. And you would reinforce that heavily so that the dog thinks this smell is interesting to me. And then from there, you can go to hiding it on someone so they can seek it out. Or you start working with someone who actually has glucose fluctuations, and you start rewarding them when they're paying attention to that smell. But dogs, even though they have this amazing sense of smell, are still going to try and get as much reward as possible. You know, if there's a good thing going, they may chance to try and get it as much as they can. So we need to be careful that dogs don't start what we call false alerting, which is when they come to you like your blood glucose levels have changed, just because they associate that with getting a reward. So what would happen in real life is that the dog would do their alert. So it might be like attention seeking, pawing, nudging, those kinds of behaviors, whatever they've been taught to do. But the owner then has to check their blood glucose levels using their glucometer. And this step is very important, because you only want to reinforce that behavior in a fully trained dog if the glucose level is too low or too high. If your glucose level is in range, you need to unfortunately just ignore that alert, because otherwise you might end up shaping a dog who just thinks this is a fun game to do no matter what. So we need to remind them that it's tied to the smell. And if they're not smelling the smell, they can't get the reward for doing the behavior. So that's the tricky thing, is obviously we can't smell whether they're actually smelling anything or not. So that kind of level of continued training needs to be maintained to make sure that the dog is still being an effective sensor.
This is quite a lot more complicated than it first sounds. For people like me, then we're just like, no, this is too messy. We need more computers here.
Well, I wanted to talk about that because one of the things that I found really interesting during that study, because I was interviewing a lot of people who have type 1 diabetes, because I was asking them too, you know, we're developing continuous glucose monitors. Why would the dog be beneficial to you as opposed to just relying on this technology? And one lady said to me that they had had type 1 diabetes from early childhood, and they had always been thought of as having something really wrong with them. So they needed all of this intervention. They were constantly having alarms going off. They were constantly having things buzzing at them to tell them to check. There was never a moment that they were kind of, everything was fine. So adding more technology to that, they really were averse to it. And I don't know if that's going to change as the generations of people change, because I know that, people in their 50s and 60s now may interact with technology very differently from people in their 10s and 20s. So that may change over time. But for her, she said that having another machine buzzing at her is not what she wants. Having this joyful being coming over to her and nudging her and turning what is a negative interaction in the sense that your blood glucose levels are going out of range into something slightly more positive is really meaningful to her. So I think this intersection between how people relate to animals and technology is also an interesting factor. And it will be interesting to see how that changes as the modern world progresses.
Yeah, no, that's a very valuable story to share. One thing that I'm very curious about here, I know psychologists like to measure things. Do we have workup performance reviews for dogs? Are there specific traits that we can measure about them?
Yes. Again, the traits that we're looking for will depend on what task we have at hand. So for assistance dogs, such as the diabetic alert dogs that we were talking about, we would need a dog that's highly motivated to work. So they want to alert their owner, but they also need a stable temperament so that they can be in public and be safe in public settings. For a biodetection dog, being calm in public wouldn't be so much of an issue because they wouldn't be working in public. But they do need to have a very specific combination of being high drive to find the odor. It's very subtle and difficult discriminations, but to be able to do that over and over again. So the laboratory dogs is picking between samples, and they would need to be doing that over and over again to give us enough trials to glean some statistical significance from. So that is quite a specific set of traits. So each role requires a different set of traits. And measuring traits in itself is an interesting part of the research field, although it's not my area of expertise. There are interesting studies going on here. So different studies have done this different ways. So some work backwards, where they look at the traits of successful accredited assistance dogs and then look for these at earlier stages. Another method is to follow dogs longitudinally as they progress through training, to try and see what traits are associated with success or release from a program. And a scale that is often used here is called the Canine Behavior Assessment and Research Questionnaire, which is shortened to CBARC, which was developed by Xu and Sapel, and it measures different aspects of a dog's character. And this is used quite a lot within the field. And the different kind of traits fall into 7 main factors. Some of them have negative valences like stranger aggression, but some of them have positive valences like trainability. And this is a questionnaire that a handler would fill out about the dog that they have in front of them. And it has been found that dogs who are successful as both physical assistants and guide dogs have scored more favorably on the CBARC than those who are released from the program. So some of these tools could be used in future. The issue is we're finding sometimes not great predictive value. So if you try and do it in too young of a dog, it doesn't hold true to the dog at 2 years old. And that's the issue here, because training a service dog is very, very expensive and very time consuming. So we want to be able to recognize traits that would either eliminate them or mean that they might be successful at the earliest stage possible. But we haven't got it entirely figured out. It's getting better. And that's the thing that many people are really working on, because a really good tool to measure that would be very valuable.
Yeah, this is very intriguing, this topic of what do we need next to be able to improve this field? And I know there are lots of exciting developments. For example, I even saw that there were some dogs being trained to detect COVID-19. But as you mentioned, there are big costs to training these dogs. There are these other issues. Could you talk about a general summary of what we need to do better on?
Yes. So I think this plays into our issue earlier of what the actual application will be for the dog. So the COVID-19 dogs, they were being used like biodetection dogs. So it was in the lab. They were getting samples from healthy individuals and people with COVID-19 and with people with other colds or viruses as a control. And they showed that there was a VOC difference in COVID-19. So there is a distinctive smell of COVID-19 and the dogs can detect it. So that's great. And that's about where we are with the cancer. But with the cancer, we're saying, okay, let's develop a new piece of technology able to diagnose cancer. With the dogs for COVID, the application that was being proposed was screening people at airports or at football stadiums, that kind of thing. And that application is where we have a question marks. So it went to such a large scale that there's clearly no way that we could have dogs replacing lateral flow tests, PCR tests, because of the sheer number of people that were needing them at the time. It's just completely unfeasible. Now, if someone wants a belt and braces approach where they have people testing on a lateral flow before they come, but also a dog at the door, they may want to have that as an additional backup because the dog can hypothetically do that. It's just whether that is the best use of resources for us at the time. And I think with COVID-19, because it was such a moving entity, at least here, we've gone from not having self-home lateral flow kits to suddenly using them every day. But now you don't need a PCR. And I know that there are operational COVID-19 dogs working, and I think that's amazing. But I think if we were to try and have a large scale project to catch up, who even knows where we'd be by the time the dogs were all ready? So it really just depends on what kind of application you want.
Makes sense. So I wonder, do you have any stats on these kinds of general issues like cost, time to train, scale?
So I don't have the stats so much, but it would be akin to dogs being trained up for explosives or drugs detection. And that is normally within the realms of minimum of months, but it could take up to a year depending on how often you can be training the dog. And the costs are normally in the tens of thousands of pounds. By the time you account for the trainer's time and the food and transport and all of those things that go into training the dogs, they need a lot of exposure in public places. It's more getting them used to working around crowds and how odor moves through the air. So it's quite a big transition from the dogs in the lab where they've got a static sample in front of them.
I guess in general, to finally talk about, where this field is headed in the future, what do you think are some major problems that we still have to solve?
I think I have two areas of concern with the field in its current state. And the first would be training practices. So you've heard me mention quite a lot about using positive reinforcement and how scientific evidence has backed up that as a good way of training. But we see use of more aversive techniques or punishment-based training. Those things are still very commonplace. And so I think seeing a shift away from that would be what I would like to see in the coming years, because we know that you can efficiently train a dog in a more humane way. So I don't see why we would still be using techniques that we know cause distress to an animal. So that would be one thing that I'd like to see. There's still very varying viewpoints on how to train a dog between different countries and different trainers within a single country. The other issue with the alert dogs who are assistance dogs, so being placed with the owners, is that, again, there's a real lack of consistency. So at the moment, if you had a specific medical condition and you wanted to have an alert dog, so you could go to an accredited charity, and these would be the dogs that would potentially be the most highly trained because they're governed by an accredited body. However, they can have a really long waiting list. And they can also be on a needs basis. So if your needs don't meet the criteria as much as someone else's, you may be bumped down the list. And that can be really frustrating for people who do have a need for a dog, but just aren't meeting the criteria of a specific charity. And in the case of the charity, the dog would be free of charge to you, but they would have absorbed a lot of the costs. Now, if you can't do that, or you're not living in an area where those things are available, you might want to seek out an individual trainer who says that they do these things. And this is especially common in the United States. And here it can be risky because a lot of these trainers are completely above board. They do an excellent job, but they will have to charge you mostly for the dog. So you may be paying, $15,000 for a dog. And you have to be really careful that this is a trained dog like you expect it to be. And there have been some really sad cases and stories of people basically getting frauded out of getting the dog that they wanted and paying all of this money for a completely untrained puppy at 8-week-old. And then the other option that people do is they train the dogs themselves. And this can be really rewarding. But again, trying to do any kind of blanket performance or quality assessments can become really difficult because if you've trained the dog yourself, it's hard to assess how proficient that dog is unless people are willing to let independent bodies come in and assess that for them. So there is just a huge variation. One person's medical alert dog might be totally different from another person. So it would be great to have more of a kind of assessment more generally and make sure that all of these dogs are working to a proficient standard. And then I think more of a academic issue is just making sure that all of the different groups are talking to each other and collaborating. So I think because it is such an intersection of different disciplines, my field falls between psychology, veterinary, and biology. And then people building e-noses could be chemistry because we need the mass spectrometry, but we also need engineers. So it requires a lot of collaboration. And I think making sure that that's happening consistently. There are some great projects going on that are doing really good work. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. But on a smaller level, I sometimes find it hard to reach the people that I need to reach to do the best work.
Yeah, no, this makes sense. And I hope this is a very exciting podcast for a lot of people. So I really do want to thank you for taking the time to explain all the way from the basics to what, this exists?
Thank you so much.